YouTube, welcome back to Cullen TV. Thank you guys so much for watching. So today we are going to take a look at the live stream for the YNW Melly trial. So today is day 3 of the trial, and I am a little late coming into the stream because I was working. So without further ado, I'm going to go on mute and let's go ahead and get into it.
On that, you said residues. When you're talking about residues, what are the different types of residues that could be left on a target?
So the main types of residues that we're examining for when we're doing muzzle target discrimination is, well, there's a few. The main one is lead and nitrites. Lead being a residue that comes from the projectile and comes from the primer residues. So those main sources of that lead. And then the nitrites are from the burning gunpowder. So gunpowder itself has nitrate as part of it. During the burning process, it converts to nitrites. And so those nitrites are fairly unique in that there's not really a whole lot of false positives for nitrites apart from gunpowder or burnt gunpowder. So those are the primary residues that we look at. If we suspect that a firearm that was used or the ammunition that was used was a clean type of projectile so that it doesn't have any lead in it, then we can test for copper in the presence of copper. But that's not the typical exam. That's usually done on special requests.
So you mentioned smoke and soot.
Yes.
Are those two different things?
Yeah, so soot, when we're talking about soot, is typically the particles or the residue that adheres to the projectile itself. And when it enters through an object, that soot is wiped off, forming a ring around wherever it came in. And then the smoke is essentially exactly that, is the appearance of a cloud around the bullet hole. So it's the smoke that's from the discharge. And those are, again, lead particles and lead, vaporous lead that comes from the discharge of that primer.
What happens to the unburnt particles of gunpowder?
So unburnt powder is not reactive with the test itself. It can be visual, so you can see it. And depending on the distance, it can still adhere to an article of clothing, it can adhere to skin. So depending on the distance from a target, you can see burnt and unburnt gunpowder being applied and stuck onto clothing. If it's a shot on skin, then you can see it essentially what they call tattooed onto skin. And that's basically the velocity and burning of the powder entering the subcutaneous levels of skin. So it basically gets captured. And so you can still see the particles visually upon the skin.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about that. Does the unburnt gunpowder travel in a predictable pattern?
Yes, so all of the particles that actually come out of the barrel will follow a predictable pattern. The projectile obviously traveling first and furthest outside of the muzzle. The following cloud of vaporous lead, particulate lead, and burnt and unburnt gunpowder will travel in a conical shape. So if you can think of the items or the powder exiting the barrel, it's going to travel at its tightest distance from the hole at the muzzle and start to expand slowly. So as it hits a target, we should see a circular impression on that target, as long as it was close enough to actually leave a pattern of powder on the target. Once it gets far enough away, usually somewhere in the ballpark of 3 to 5 feet, then it ceases to leave any powder because it's all fallen out of, basically lost all of its velocity and dropped out of the air. So it has to be close enough that it can impact an object with sufficient force that it gets stuck on that object.
Okay, so you said that cloud travels a maximum of 3 to 5 feet.
Yes.
Can you make a determination without a firearm as to the distance a cloud would travel based on a casing?
No. So the reason that we don't do any examination like that is because there are many variables that come into play. So like I mentioned earlier, the barrel length, that's one significant variable. If the barrel length is 2 inches versus 6 inches versus 7 inches versus being a submachine gun that might have a 12-inch barrel or a 13-inch barrel, all of that will play a significant role in how much powder comes out of the barrel and how far that will reproduce. And so when we reproduce these patterns, the way that these muzzle target distance determinations are actually done is the first step is to visually examine the unknown, right? So the question impressions. We don't know how far that is. So we'll process it, make sure that there are gunpowder particles present and that there is a pattern present. Once we've determined that part of it, then we have to reproduce it with the knowns. Those knowns are known ammunition. So in this particular case, it's a 40 Smith & Wesson Blazer. I would use 40 Smith & Wesson Blazer. So I'm not going to use a Federal cartridge case. I'm not going to use a Hornady cartridge case. I'm going to use the same manufacturer that was used in the evidence that was submitted.
Why is it important to use the same manufacturer?
Because if I'm using the same manufacturer, I'm reducing the number of variables that could potentially be in place. So the same manufacturer should be using the same type of powder, same shape of powder, and typically when we're going to do that, we will open the powder, we'll open the cartridge and ensure that the amount of powder and the type of powder is consistent with what we're seeing in the evidence. If it's not, then we're going to try to use something that is consistent. So that.
Would you try and minimize things such as lot numbers, date of manufacture, those types of variables as well?
If possible, yes.
Just so we're clear, are you conducting a science experiment?
Essentially, that's what we're doing, is we're trying to reduce the number of variables present so that we can give an estimated range of distance. And even then, even when we can account for, we know it's the right firearm, we know it's the right ammunition, we know the type of primer that was used, and oftentimes we'll be submitted a firearm that has ammunition left in it. And if there is ammunition left in it, then our typical examination is going to be to reproduce the patterns at interval distances, so 6 inches, 12 inches, 18 inches, and so forth. And then once we've shot that with, let's say in this case, 40 Smith & Wesson Blazer, whatever distance is closest to what I found in the evidence, I'll reproduce with evidence ammunition, so that it's the same ammunition that was found in the firearm at the time that it was impounded. And I'll use that as part of my conclusions as well. So normally when we're going to report that, it's going to be a range of distance. I'm not just saying this firearm was discharged at a distance of 12 inches.
Why not?
The reason we don't do that is we can't account for environmental factors. I can't account for how the clothing was handled. Was there an intervening object? So there's so many variables that you can't just give one distance. Even within ammunition manufacturers, Blazer can put a grain or two more of powder in one cartridge and a grain or two less in the next cartridge. And so there is variability even within the same manufacturer in the same lot number. So as much as they try to keep it to where there's a standard, they have a tolerance, and that tolerance still allows for potential variability. So when we reproduce these tests, the way that we're typically reporting it is that a firearm, or the muzzle to target distance determination states that the muzzle of the firearm was no closer than 6 inches, no further than 18 inches. And the edges of that bracket essentially means that I've test fired everything in between and beyond, and I can tell you that the firearm could not have reproduced a pattern that was observed closer than 3 inches, and it could not have done it beyond 18 inches. Right, so I'm giving that range because maybe within that range, there was some overlap. So if I shot it at 12 inches and I shot it at 14 inches, the patterns can be very, very similar. So not different enough that I can distinguish the patterns with a naked eye. So if that's the case, then I have to be able to include both of those distances.
So you said intervening objects a couple of times. I don't know if we've properly defined that. What would be an intervening object in firearms and distance determination?
So depending on the object that's being examined, an intervening object can be anything like a car door, the front door to a house. If a person was wearing several layers of clothing and the person was flat shot, the external object is an intervening object to everything beneath that. So basically, the first object that the projectile hits is the object that has the potential to have powder on it. Anything thereafter will not have any powder on it. So if somebody was shot and they were wearing a baseball cap, the baseball cap is going to contain the vast majority of those powder particles. Some of them may make it through the cap, and some of them may be present on the person themselves, but the vast majority is going to be on the baseball cap.
What about human hair?
Sure, so if somebody shot in the head and you have human hair, that hair is going to capture most of the powder particles.
Yeah, you mentioned a pattern of in the powder pursuing and the unburnt gunpowder. Can you describe to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury when you say a pattern, what do you mean?
So when the powder,
Would
sorry,
it help if you could draw on the screen?
sure.
I can change the. You should be able to draw that.
So the powder, I'll draw a couple of different things. I'm not an artist, so please excuse anything that seems very rudimentary. So if we're talking about this as being the muzzle of the firearm, the powder is going to exit in a pattern that looks like this, right? So when it hits an object that's flat, perpendicular to the firearm, the pattern that's observed is going to look something. I don't know if you can actually see the dots that I'm drawing.
See if we can change your options for drawing tools. Try that one, see if that works better.
Okay, well, we can work with that. So if each one of those bigger dots is a flake of gunpowder, then the travel of the powder itself opening in this conical area like that is going to impact this perpendicular area and leave a circular impression or circular pattern of these dots, of these different particles. So when we're talking about reproducing a pattern, the pattern that we're looking for is the density of the powder and how far that distribution goes. So the further away from a target, the bigger that pattern is going to be and the less dense it's going to be. The closer, then the tighter the pattern is going to be and the more dense it's going to be. And there are particles that don't travel very far. So if the pattern is far enough, let's say something like 18 inches, you're not going to see vaporous lead. So that lead cloud, the smoke that's observed at close distances, is no longer present after a certain distance. But you can still get a circular pattern of burnt and unburnt gunpowder.
So you said vaporous lead falls out at 18 inches. Is that based on training, experience?
Yeah, it's a combination of training experience. There's articles that have been done on it and have been published into the GSR training handbook by the FBI. And so it can even be closer to that. Again, that's part of those variables that we have to account for. So was there vaporous lead present? Was there not vaporous lead present? So my testing has to be able to reproduce whatever I'm observing in the unknown. And then I have to include whatever I'm observing in my bracket.
Okay. So when you're talking about then, you said a parallel surface.
Mhm.
Do you have to take into account curvature of surfaces, anything like that?
Sure, you have to take into account also the size of the surface. So if this surface, instead of being this size, is only this size, it's going to capture whatever's landing on it at that time. So what that means is that if my area is only this big, then all of the powder north and south of it aren't hitting anything. So that powder keeps on traveling and doesn't hit anything. It only hits whatever is present there. So all of that does play a factor in your distance determination and how you can reproduce it. And which is part of the challenge of distance determinations is we have to try to reproduce whatever we're seeing. That's the only way we're going to be able to know what that distance is if we can actually physically reproduce it.
Okay. If you have a 4-inch barrel versus a 7 or a 10-inch barrel, how does that change the shape of the cloud or the cone as it travels?
Well, I can change a few different things. So the cloud itself is going to come out of the barrel at a higher velocity the longer the barrel is. It's also coming out with less powder because a lot of that powder has been consumed inside of the barrel. And so two things are gonna change there in that the width of this cone becomes narrower further out. And so if you don't have the correct firearm, you're not actually reproducing that pattern.
Let me make sure I'm clear, the
Sure.
width becomes narrower farther out on a longer barrel.
Correct,
Okay.
correct. So the shorter the barrel, the wider that the cone becomes at a shorter distance. And the higher the density of the particles that are going to be observed, because there's more particles present. And the longer barrel, those particles have been consumed during that combustion, and so less particles and less materials actually exiting the barrel.
Okay, so Mr. Bello, if you, for whatever reason, don't have the firearm that was used in whatever distance determination you're trying to recreate, could you use a brand new, same make, same model, same caliber firearm to do this determination?
Well, in the absence of a firearm, I don't know what that firearm that was used. So I have no way of saying, okay, well, I'm going to use, let's say all the fire characteristics say it's a Glock. Well, which type of Glock? Is it a Glock 17? Is it a Glock 19? Is it a Glock 43? Is it a Glock 45? So all of those different models fire the same caliber, but they have differences in design. One of those key differences is barrel length. And so without knowing that it was in fact a particular Glock 17, I have no way of being able to reproduce that pattern because I can't account for those variables. I don't know what the make and model is of the firearm.
Is there any way you can account for any aftermarket alterations to a firearm?
Not without identifying the firearm first.
And could you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what types of aftermarket, post-manufacturer alterations are possible on a .40 caliber handgun?
So depending on the handgun itself, you can essentially get down to the point where you've created your own new firearm. You can replace firing pins, you can replace extractors, you can replace ejectors, you can replace the slide, you can replace barrels. You can replace almost every portion of that firearm and still have what they would technically call the same firearm based on the serial number. So the serial number is imparted on the frame, and so long as you have the same frame, you technically have the same firearm. And what I mean by that is if I were to have a Glock firearm and its serial number is USA 123, and I call Glock and I say, hey, I have a Glock firearm, it's a USA 123, can you tell me what the make and model was? They'll tell me it's a Glock, it's a model 17. But I could have changed it to a 19. I could have put a different barrel length on it. I could have put an aftermarket barrel, which is not polygonal, it's conventional. So I could have changed any number of variables. The manufacturer has no way of knowing that, right? So unless you have the physical firearm present to do your comparisons and say, yes, this projectile, this cartridge case were produced by the firearm in question, then I have no way of saying that's the firearm that was used.
Okay. Does the FBI set forth best practices and materials to use for doing a distance determination?
Yes, they do.
And what would they recommend?
So the FBI recommends that you only do this determination if you've been able to identify fired evidence from a crime scene to a firearm. And so you've been able to do test fires from the firearm and come to a conclusion saying that that firearm produced the evidence at the scene.
Okay,
So that's the first requirement.
so that's number one. What about the type of material you're going to be shooting into?
So the FBI recommends using cotton twill as a substrate. It's just a substrate that they have found as a happy medium, if you will. So it doesn't capture too much particle or it doesn't capture too little particle. It fairly represents a large number of surfaces.
Okay. Can you use like ballistics gel?
You could try to use ballistics gel. The problem with ballistics gel is you wouldn't be able to process it afterwards. It's also transparent in nature, and so seeing the powder itself is going to be very difficult. And so while you could use it, it's not something that the FBI recommends doing.
Could you use an animal skin to replicate human skin?
I've heard people using pig skin. I believe they say that's most similar to human skin that you can get. So that's something that they have done. Again, you can't chemically process skin, but you can visually examine them and see the difference between the patterns in the pig skin and the human skin, as the tones tend to be very similar and the texture tends to be very similar.
Okay, what about plastic covering an Amazon box to go to your house?
Probably wouldn't use that.
Why
So the different materials are going to have different rates of capture. So that powder can hold onto cloth one way, and as you can imagine, tape is a fairly slick surface, and cardboard is a hard surface. Not the same thing as clothing, not the same thing as skin. Our skin is elastic, cardboard is not elastic, and so how powder would adhere to our skin or to our clothing is significantly different than how it would adhere to cardboard or Scotch tape or packing tape or anything like that.
Okay, so now the question, final on this one. Did you do a distance determination in this case?
No, I did not.
Why not?
So the first thing is I didn't have a firearm, so I can't know which firearm I'm going to use in order to replicate any of my tests. So I can't make tests for this determination because I don't know what firearm was used.
Okay. Do you have a overall list of potential firearms that could have caused the ballistics evidence in this, or created the ballistics evidence in this case?
Yes, so I did use the projectiles and the visible characteristics from the cartridge case, and I ran the information through the general rifling characteristics database that the FBI initially made, and now it's being housed by the Association of Firearms Examiners. And it did come back with a list. It was a fairly lengthy list of firearms manufacturers. And so when the list contains that many, we don't typically report out a list of suspect weapons because it's just too many to report. We essentially just insert a report that if you need the list, let us know and we'll let you know how many firearms and which ones they are that could have fired this evidence. And that list is by no means exhaustive either. So there's really no way to know that that's all of the firearms that could have fired it, or was there a homemade firearm that fired it, or any other parts of like these kind of parts guns that they sell nowadays. There's really no way to rule any of those out. So this is just a list of major manufacturers that reported to the FBI their characteristics.
And so approximately how many firearms were listed out in this case?
I have to look at the
Can you refresh your recollection? Please feel free to do so. Slow cut when you've done so.
Hold on, y'all. I have to look at these comments because Melly facial expressions are taking me out. Let's see. It's moving fast.
So as far as manufacturers that could have fired the projectiles in 40 Smith & Wesson, there's about 15 different major manufacturers. I also ran it again with, there was 2 submissions to me in the case.
Okay.
So there was an initial submission that contained 3 projectiles, and then there was an initial secondary submission which contained projectiles from the medical examiner's office. And based on the characteristics of the second submission, there was, I think, an even larger number. About 27 manufacturers that could have fired that set.
Okay. Can you just pick number 17 off that list and and recreate a distance determination?
No, I can't do that, for a variety of reasons. First and foremost being that these lists are telling me the manufacturers, right? It's not telling me the make and model. So give me the make. So it's saying, possibly Sig Sauer, possibly Sig Orange, but which one of their pistols in 40? It doesn't tell me that. And so the list can be very, very lengthy. It also won't tell me the barrel length of the particular firearm.
I'm gonna ask you about a very specific firearm.
Mm.
Could you use a Taurus 91?
No.
Why not?
The Taurus 91 doesn't exist.
Should I be asking about horsepower on that?
You could, I guess, but there's no Taurus. So Taurus manufactures a line of firearms which they bought the patent from Beretta to manufacture. Beretta makes what they call Beretta 92, Beretta 92 FS, and so Taurus replicates that in their PT 92 and PT 99. So those are the two variants of that particular pistol. There really isn't, and the 9 designates the 9mm caliber. So PT 92 and PT 99 are 9mm variants of that Beretta replicant that they have.
Okay, and that's actually the red gun in front of you. Is it a PT 92 replica?
Correct. So this is exactly what you would see if you saw a Beretta or a Taurus, whether it's a 92 or PT 92. They look the same. If I held it from over here and I had a Beretta or a Taurus, you wouldn't know the difference between one and the other.
Okay. And that was which caliber for the 92?
So the 92 is a 9mm firearm.
Okay. Is there a 40 caliber that may be closely named to that?
So Taurus does make a 40 caliber. They make it under the model name PT 100, PT 101.
In terms of the list of firearms that are potential, are some more common than others that you see in the lab?
Yes, sure.
Would that help you in doing a distance determination?
No, again, because it doesn't tell me which one of their models was used and the barrel length of those models that was used.
Okay. So I want to go through now and talk about the individual items of evidence you reviewed in this case. Okay? So I'm going to start here with item that you assigned as item 13.
Okay.
And this, I'm sure, has been previously entered into evidence as states 43.
Okay.
Do you recognize that exhibit?
Yes, I do.
How do you recognize that?
So my initials on the paper bag and the date that I started the examination, as well as my initials and the date that I finished the examination on the seals.
Okay. If I may have that back so I can put it up on the screen so it's clear to everybody what we're talking about when we're talking about exhibit 13. When you're talking about exhibit 13, these white labels here on the back, did you place those on there?
Yes, I did.
And if you'd be so kind as to, do you know how to hit erase on the screen?
Is there just erase everything?
Or clear?
There we go.
Thank you.
Yep.
So exhibit 13 labeled G115. Where does the G115 come from?
So the G115 is the external identifier, so that's whatever the person who impounded the evidence itself labeled it.
Okay.
Typically, that's given to us in the form of a property receipt.
Is that
So,
the 115, the number that's there, is that
Yeah.
the same? So on exhibit 13, there's also a case number under there. What is that case number?
so that should be the lab number that's assigned again by the lab. So that 1813127, that's the number that's generated by our information management system. Every case that comes to us has to have a unique identifier, and because we're a county lab, We service a lot of different municipalities. We can't guarantee that their numbers won't overlap, but as a lab, we still have to have unique identifiers. And so the system, regardless as to what their identifier is, which in this case was the one below that, at least according to our information management system, we have to have that unique identifier put in place by the laboratory. And so that in this case, it was 1813127.
And is that the same for all the disciplines the lab covers?
Yes, so it should, there are cases where sometimes an exhibit might be submitted and either they thought it was affiliated with a different case or something like that, and they gave it a separate lab number. So you might have a separate unique lab number, but you can't have two cases under the same lab number.
Understood. So going to Exhibit 13, you describe to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what you do to analyze Exhibit 13.
So for pretty much any exhibit, the first step I'm going to do is to try to see that whatever I received in evidence is what I'm supposed to have. With fire cartridge cases and projectiles, it's a little bit more difficult just because, as you can see in this case, they're submitted in a brown paper bag or a sealed manila envelope. That's the typical kind of submission for casings and projectiles. So I'll try to feel the evidence and see, okay, this is a bag, it says it has 3 projectiles. Does it have what feels like 3 projectiles? Or does it have a magazine? Or does it have live ammunition? So if I can feel that difference, then I'll stop there and say, okay, whoever submitted this has to make some kind of correction because they're telling me they submitted 3 projectiles, but that's not what I have. In this case, that wasn't the case. It said I had 3 projectiles inside this package, and I had 3 projectiles. So then I opened the packaging, and I start to describe what I have in front of me. In this particular case, it was 3 fire projectiles, and so I described them as 3 fire projectiles. If there are cartridge cases, then I'll describe them as 1 fired 40 Smith & Wesson Blazer cartridge case. And that'll be the description for each of the cartridge cases, which is just the caliber, manufacturer, and whether or not it was fired or live.
Okay, so on item that your lab number assigned 13, that is the G115 identifier. Do you know where that came from?
I don't know where that came from.
Did you collect it?
No,
Do you ever go and collect projectile or casing evidence?
no, I don't.
Is that part of your job description?
No.
Do you go to any of the crime scenes?
On occasion, we can be called to come out to crime scenes if they're looking for some kind of possible explanation, but that would be a very, very rare case. More often than not, we stay at the lab and we just receive evidence that crime scene or a detective collected.
Okay, and where is the lab located?
It's on the first floor of this building.
So moving on to, again, item 13G115, did you describe it as?
So item 13 was 1 fired projectile.
What analysis did you do on item 13?
So every projectile in every cartridge case is going to receive every projectile will receive a projectile worksheet or a bullet worksheet. On that worksheet, we capture information that is standard. And the basis for that worksheet is just to see, okay, am I looking at a 40 caliber projectile? Am I looking at a 38 caliber projectile? Am I looking at a 45 caliber projectile? The importance of that is that if I have different calibers, they couldn't have been shot in the same firearm. And so that will preclude me from moving on to the next step of taking the evidence to the comparison microscope. If everything has the same characteristics, where it's a 40 caliber projectile, they have or could have 6 land impressions, they all twist to the right, then they all could have been fired from the same firearm at that point because all the class characteristics align. Then I would have to take them to the microscope to see if I can individualize them. So at that point, I'm looking for the individual characteristics to see whether they were fired at the same firearm or whether we have 2 separate firearms involved or 3 separate firearms involved. So until I do that final, I won't know how many firearms are actually involved.
So you do that for every item that's submitted projectile-wise initially?
Yes.
Okay, so we won't go through that on each one. Okay. Specifically on Exhibit 13, the G115, what caliber was that projectile?
It's a 40 caliber projectile.
When you say 40 caliber, does that translate to millimeters, inches, some other specialty?
So 40 caliber is actually in inches. It has a synonym in metric, so it has a 10 millimeter synonym. So 40 caliber is if I took the widest portion of the projectile itself, it would measure 0.4 inches from one side to the other. If I changed it to metric, it should measure about 10 millimeters from one side to the other.
Okay. How do you know the difference in tell between a 40 caliber and a 10 millimeter? They're equal.
So the projectile itself really can't tell me the difference. So when we list them as a 40 caliber as opposed to 40 Smith & Wesson. But 40 Smith & Wesson is also a much more popular cartridge. For every, I can't tell you the last time I saw a 10 millimeter auto in the lab. I think probably for every 5 years, we might see 1 or 2 10 millimeter autos. Whereas we'll see a 40 Smith & Wesson almost daily coming to the lab. So just the difference in popularity of the two is what's going to push it towards being a 40 Smith & Wesson versus a 10 millimeter.
So when you're looking at the projectile, how do you take into account any deformities from hitting intervening objects or the rifling on the barrel? How do you measure and still take those into account?
Sure. So when I'm looking at the worksheet, one of the portions of the worksheet we use to describe the physical evidence we have. That's especially true and important for projectiles. We can get projectiles that are relatively pristine, but that's not the norm. Most projectiles that we receive in evidence, whether they hit a person or they hit a car or they hit a tree, are deformed from hitting something. And so it's very important for us to describe what damage we're seeing on the projectiles for a variety of reasons. One of them being that if I can't measure the exact diameter of the base, I need to know why I couldn't measure the exact diameter of the base. So is it because the base is missing? Or is it because it's just deformed, it's pancaked, it's flattened out, so I can't get an accurate measurement? And so that's one part of it. The other part of it is I do look for the class characteristics of the number of line impressions. If the damage is that half of the projectile is missing, and I have 2 land impressions, well, I don't know, did it have 6 land impressions total? Did it have 5 land impressions total and I only have 2 left? And so at that point, if I'm missing that information, I can't determine whether or not the class characteristics really line up until I take it to a microscope and start measuring the width of the line impressions and determine that, okay, if the width of the line impressions are this, then it has to be 6 line impressions. Or if it's a larger line impression, then it has to be 5 line impressions. So all of those characteristics are notated in our notes page for those different reasons.
Can you look at shrapnel or tiny, tiny pieces of a projectile and get those land and groove impressions?
Depending what's there, we could. So if, let's say, the jacket that's on here peeled off, and now instead of having 1 jacket, I end up having 5 or 6 fragments of a jacket. I can look at those fragments and see if there is a land impression present, or if there's a partial land impression present. That won't let me know the class characteristics of the firearm, but if there's enough information in that land impression that's present, I could make a comparison to other projectiles. So depending on how much is left of those fragments, I can. If the jacket came off of a core, right, so like the inside of this projectile that would have been lead, that core doesn't actually impact the firearm itself, right? It's covered by the jacket. So that core doesn't have any information that I can use to then make comparisons. So if it's just a lead core, there's nothing that I can do with that. Apart from maybe say it could have come from a 40 Smith & Wesson or it could have come from a 9 millimeter. But that's about as far as I can go with that examination because there are no class characteristic or individual characteristics present on that from the firearm.
Okay. So staying on Exhibit 13, was there a number of lands and grooves on Exhibit 13?
Yes. So Exhibit 13 had 6 landing grooves.
Okay. Did it have a direction of twist you were able to document?
Yes, it was right-handed twist.
Okay. Did it have a bullet weight?
Yes, so the overall weight of that projectile was 179.4 grains.
179.4 grains. Okay. What is a cannelore?
So a cannelore is a mark that's put in by the manufacturers. It's served many purposes in the past. Nowadays, a lot of them are putting it in there just for aesthetics. So it's a ring that goes around the circumference of the projectile itself. Before, cannelores were put in place for lubrication. That was their primary purpose, is they would line that indentation in the projectile with lubrication so that as the projectile traveled through the barrel, it simultaneously lubricated the barrel, or at least that was the thought. It turns out that they travel at such velocities that they're really not lubricating anything in that barrel. They're just flying out of there and taking most of the lubrication with them. And so nowadays you can have cannelores, but most manufacturers today don't really use cannelores.
Did Exhibit 13 have that feature?
13 did not have any cannelores.
What material was the bullet made out of?
So the material was copper and lead.
Is there a type or of the jacket that you described earlier?
Mm-hmm.
Do you catalog that as to Exhibit 13?
Yeah, so Exhibit 13 was a full metal jacket, so it's very similar to what you're seeing here in that it had a rounded nose and the base of it was not jacketed. So the lead of the core was exposed in the base.
Okay, so full metal jacket. Was it magnetic?
It was not magnetic.
The lands and grooves, could you see 6 of each of them?
Yes.
The rifling, is there a type of rifling or characteristics of rifling?
So the rifling type itself was conventional, and all that really means is a lot like this model. Conventional rifling has very clearly defined shoulders or edges to the impression. If it were to be polygonal, they kind of have the inside of the barrel looks almost like a hill, and so there are not clearly defined edges that are visible on the projectiles that come from polygonal barrels.
And polygonal barrels are commonly used in what type or manufacturer of firearms?
So the most common is Glock, and then the second most common is probably H&K or Bersa.
So moving on to, based on what you have, do you come up and estimate a estimated total bullet weight before it was fired?
Yeah, so the manufacturer intended weight would have been about 180 grams.
And is that consistent with a 40 Smith & Wesson Blazer cartridge?
Yes.
Do you document additional defects or anything as to Exhibit 13?
Yes, I do.
What do you document?
So additionally to what we've already discussed, I'll document the packaging, so how exactly it was submitted. You can see that the external package is a brown paper bag, but inside of that, most agencies will have some kind of sub-packaging that will separate the individual items in the bag. So in this case, it was submitted inside of a small tin can, inside of a brown paper bag.
So I'm going to go ahead and publish your Exhibit 13, which is part of States 43. Do you additionally, when you are labeling them, sub-label the item inside as well, or do you rely upon?
The tin might have either my handwriting or the label.
Okay. So is that your label?
Yes.
Okay.
That's it.
The handwriting here, the number 7 projectile rear passenger floorboard 1824. Is that you?
No.
So when you're talking about the nose
Mhm.
of the bullet, can you show the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what you mean by the nose of the bullet?
Yeah, so the nose of the bullet would be this area right here. And then this is the base of the bullet itself. And then this is the land impression, or one of the land impressions. And you can see that from the base to the nose, it is slanted right, if I were to make the base flat. And so it has that right hand twist.
And when you measure the lands and grooves, do you document those measurements?
I do.
Why do you do that?
So the primary purpose for that is, again, to see the class characteristics, so the width of the lands and the grooves. If there is a significant difference between those numbers in between two projectiles, then that would preclude it from having to fire the same firearm. And then additionally, I can take those numbers and put them into the general rifling characteristics database and see if there's any suspect weapons that have those same measurements.
Okay. So I'm going to move on now to Exhibit 14 in this same, your Exhibit 14. Is that your label that's placed on there?
Yes.
What description did you have as to the G number for Exhibit 14?
116.
And this number 24 projectile, front driver's side floor, under brake pedal, 1846. Is that your handwriting?
No.
Okay. So looking at your Exhibit 14, G116, I want to go through those same questions again. What was the measurable caliber of that item?
So the caliber measured to be .401.
And how does that compare to the last one?
It's very similar. I mean, a slight difference. The other one, I believe, measured at .400. So it's a difference of 1/1000th of an inch. That's within tolerances for the same caliber.
Okay. How many lands and grooves did you see on this particular one?
I saw at least 4 landing grooves that were present. The other 2 were either damaged or just not readily visible.
Okay. The bullet weight, what was this?
It was 167.4 grains.
What were the materials?
It was also copper and lead.
Any candelure?
No.
Did you see candelures on any of the projectiles here?
No.
The jacket type, what was it on Exhibit your 14?
It was also a full metal jacket, so it has that same characteristic where it has either a flat or a rounded nose and an open base where the base is exposed, the lead core is exposed.
So in here you said there was only 4 lands or grooves visible.
Mhm.
How does that compare with the last one? That you said there were 6 lands and grooves.
So the last one had 6 landing grooves that were visible. These 4 landing grooves are visible just because of damage, so there are parts of the jacket that have been ripped off. Likely due to passing through an object or impact. And so that's the only difference really.
And you said passing through an object. You previously talked about going through glass. What other items would cause damage to a bullet?
Honestly, it could be almost anything. If it went through a body and hit bone, it could fragment, it could have the jacket peeled off. If it hit a car door, if it went through any kind of harder object. Most of these, all projectiles really, are intended to enter an object that's mainly liquid, right? So whether it's us, a deer, or any animal, the primary composition of us is liquid. So apart from bone, there's really not anything that's hard inside of our bodies, just like any kind of animal. And so any impact with bone or hard object like bone would cause damage to the projectiles.
On Exhibit 14, were you able to determine a estimated original grain weight?
I believe it was, I left it as undetermined because enough of it was missing that I couldn't say 100%. Obviously, it has to have weight at least 167 grains because there's material missing. And so it precludes certain calibers, but I didn't want to give an exact probable weight just because of how much was missing.
With regards to the notes that you've made with regards to your analysis of this, how did you document your additional data or findings?
So the projectile has damage to most sides of the projectile itself, with the jacket missing in several different portions of it. The base of the projectile remains relatively intact, which is, again, not necessarily abnormal. If you think about how a projectile travels, the nose of the projectile is the first thing that's going to impact anything. The base is the last thing that's going to impact anything. So more often than not, the more significant damage is on the nose end of the projectile, and the base is usually the area that remains the least damaged. And it does have some of the land impressions intact, which could be measured.
Were the lands and grooves consistent with Exhibit 13 in measurements?
Yes, they were in similar range of sizes.
So, Mr. Bello, how do you make sure that you don't accidentally put Exhibit 13 in Exhibit 14's container? What types of controls are in place at the lab to prevent that?
So when we examine the projectiles themselves, typically the projectiles are going to have some kind of labeling, usually put on there by myself as well, either a permanent marker or in a scribe, which is just a metal pen. I could write on metal with it. But aside from that, we are only handling evidence from one particular case at that time or at that moment in time. And so if something were to be swapped, theoretically speaking, it may get swapped 15 to 16 or 16 to 15, but it wouldn't be 15 from this case to 15 from a different case. Because I'm only looking at evidence from this case at one time.
If you have one that is a known and one that is a questioned, what steps do you take to make sure those are kept identified and separate?
So the knowns are also typically labeled with the exhibit number of that known. So if let's say there's a known firearm, they'll be labeled T1 or T2, so test 1, test 2. And so that will clearly distinguish it from any of the evidence in the case.
Okay. So moving on to Exhibit 15. Is this your label that is on there?
Yes.
What's the purpose of the barcode that's on all of these?
So it's a barcode that really our system itself puts in place. And that barcode just contains that same information that's underneath. So if you were to scan that barcode, it would just give you its Exhibit 15, external ID, 117, case number, and lab number. So that's really all it is. It's just a replication of the below information in barcode format.
In terms of when you first get the evidence, when it's given to you, how do you retrieve it?
So I retrieve the evidence from the firearms vault. So the firearms unit actually houses all of its evidence inside of our own unit. We have a fairly large room that's secured by alarm and a vault door where all of the evidence is kept. When I'm going to work on a case, because I'm the supervisor, I also will assign myself the case. So I'll pull the evidence, I'll assign it, and then I go to the vault physically and I retrieve the evidence from our evidence vault.
Do you work on more than one case at a time?
I only ever have the evidence for one case open at one time. So one case open.
When you are finished with the items of evidence, where does it go back to?
So when I'm done with the evidence, it'll get sealed back up into the original packaging. If the original packaging is too damaged or something's off with it, then I'll create a new packaging for it. And then it'll be sent back to our central receiving, which then sends it back to whoever the submitting agency was.
Do you reseal it with evidence tape and your name and CCN?
Yes.
What is a CCN?
So CCN is just a badge number. It's an employee identification number.
Are you a sworn law enforcement officer?
No.
Okay. Are you a civilian employee of the sheriff's office?
Yes.
Okay. The large green sticker that's on these items, is that placed on by the lab as well?
Yes.
So going to your Exhibit 15, described as G117. Did you measure the caliber of this particular projectile?
Yes.
Okay, what was the measurable caliber?
So the caliber for that one measured to be .400 inches.
Okay, so that's the same as your Exhibit 13?
Yes.
On the number of lands and groups, how many were there?
There were 6.
What was the direction of twist?
It was a right-handed twist.
Did you have a bullet weight you were able to determine?
It weighed 179.4 grams.
Was the materials able to be determined as to what this bullet was made of?
Yes, it was also made of copper and lead.
What type of jacket was it?
So like the other two, it was a full metal jacketed projectile.
Was it magnetic?
No.
Were you able to view all 6 lands and all 6 groups?
Yes.
The rifling type, what was it?
It was also conventional.
Were you able to determine a probable grain weight of the original bullet, an estimate?
Yes, so there's also 180 grains.
With that information, were you able to determine a potential caliber?
It was also 40 Smith & Wesson, yes.
The damage or anything to this projectile, what did you document?
That the nose was slightly flattened, and that there are parts where the copper jacket is missing. However, the projectile's base is in good condition.
Okay. Did you measure the landing grooves on this one as well?
I did.
Were they consistent with the other three?
Yes.
Okay. So once you've looked at these three projectiles, are those the first three projectiles you got in the initial submission?
Yes.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that there was 2 separate submissions.
Mhm.
Did you do a comparison between exhibits 13, 14, and 15?
I did.
And how did you do that comparison?
So once I did the worksheets and I saw that none of the evidence really could have been precluded from being fired in the same firearm, based on just the class characteristics that were observed, I took the projectiles to the comparison microscope and I looked at them underneath the comparison microscope.
So going back to the first photo we looked at earlier, at the bottom it says exhibit 13 and 15.
Correct.
What does that indicate to you that these are showing photos of?
So that projectile or exhibit 13 is on the left stage, so on the left side of the microscope, and exhibit 15 is the projectile that's on the right side of the microscope.
Were you able to come to a conclusion as to whether or not they were fired in the same firearm?
And yes, there was sufficient agreement of individual characteristics to say that both of these projectiles came from the same firearm.
Okay, so I want to make sure we're clear. Were the class characteristics the same?
They were.
How does the class characteristics being the same, is that enough for you to say an individualized, that they are a match from the same firearm?
No, it doesn't.
So explain the individual characteristics.
Right,
that
so-
you were able to show.
The class characteristics, like we talked about earlier, was the caliber, the number of lancing grooves, the width of the lancing groove. So the measurement from this black line to this line down here needs to be consistent. And obviously, if you can imagine that this is the impression that's coming from the barrel of the firearm, if this impression is all the way out to here, then that's a different firearm. There's no way that they could have come from the same firearm. So once all of those class characteristics agree, then I can say, okay, well, they came from the same type of firearm at least. Let's find out whether or not they came from the same firearm. Then what I'm looking for is all of these scratches that are in here. So this individual detail that comes from the manufacturing process of that land impression. So that's the area that is raised inside the barrel of the firearm that leaves this recessed area in the projectile. And the agreement of all of these different little scratches that you can see is the agreement that I'm looking for to determine whether or not they did come from the same firearm.
Mr. Bell, does the magazine being different or changed in any way alter the way a firearm operates?
No, not typically. So as long as a magazine is a functioning magazine, so it still has a spring inside of it, it still has its floor plate, feed ramp, then as long as the magazine fits in that firearm, you can use any magazine that would fit in that firearm.
There are magazines that come standard with the firearms.
Yes, there
So
are.
there are aftermarket magazines that are available as well.
Yes.
Is there any way to tell from the projectile what type of magazine it was loaded in?
No, there's really no way to know what magazine it came from.
Is there any way to know from the casing what type of magazine it was loaded in?
Not the type of magazine. Sometimes the magazine can leave marks on casings. So sometimes it could be possible to compare marks from known replicas of a magazine to unknowns. But again, that is sometimes, that's not all the time. And so there's really not a way to know, in the absence of a magazine or the absence of a firearm, there's really no way to know which magazine it came from or what type of magazine it came from.
So we talked about exhibit 14, which was the G116.
Yep.
Were you able to do the same examination and say that exhibit 14 came from the same firearm as 13 and 15?
So exhibit 14 had similar class characteristics. The weight could have put it in the 40 caliber class. The width from that line to that line was very similar to these two exhibits, but there wasn't enough detail present. So these lines that I'm looking at in here didn't reproduce well on this other projectile. So in the absence of information, I can't eliminate it as having been fired from the same firearm, because sometimes firearms can mark slightly different. And so the absence of information doesn't allow me to eliminate it as having been fired from the same firearm, but I can also not identify it because there's not enough agreement. And so that's where it falls into an inconclusive class where it could have been fired in the same firearm, but without this additional information, I can't really say for sure whether or not it came from the same firearm.
And so it's clear for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, do you photograph each and every one of the comparisons that you make?
No, I'll photograph a representative of the identifications I make. Basically what that means, if I identify all of my projectiles on this particular land impression, then I'm gonna take one picture of this land impression. If I couldn't identify one of them on this one, but the next one over, then I'll also photograph that comparison because it's a different comparison. The only reason we do that is that really for brevity's sake, if I had 12 comparisons, they would all look like this. And so it's kind of useless to have 12 pictures that all look the same and say, look, here's 12 pictures. This representation is the same thing I was looking at if I made other identifications on this land impression.
And so you indicated that there were 6 Lansing grooves on 13 and 15.
Mhm.
When you're doing a comparison, do you match it each and every one of those?
Yes, we certainly attempt to.
Your Honor, this may be a logical breaking point for lunch.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take our luncheon recess now. Just leave your notepads on your chairs. Remember the admonition, do not discuss the case, don't form any opinion about the case, don't allow anyone to discuss the case in presence. First, no research, we'll see everybody back at 1:30, all right? Have a nice lunch.
All right, guys. So they are going to adjourn for lunch right now. So I will be sure to jump back on here. They said that they'll be back at 1:30. So I will catch you guys then. Have a great day. Peace.